On her wedding day, Rome rejoiced. The empire believed purity had returned to the throne. But behind the garlands of gold and hymns of virtue, a quiet rebellion began. In 38 CE, a 15-year-old girl became the most powerful woman in the world, and in time, its most feared. Her name was Valeria Messalina. The chronicles praise her beauty. Archaeology whispers her corruption. Who paid the price for Rome's virtue when its empress turned it into spectacle? The records fall silent, but the ruins still speak. If you value the historical record, subscribe. When the ledger closes, the bones still speak. At 15, Valeria Messalina walked through the marble halls of the Palatine Palace, draped in white silk, her face a portrait of Roman ideal youth, fertility, and noble blood. Beside her stood Claudius, 50 years old, limping scholarly and awkward. To the public, their union was divine balance. Innocence, matched with intellect, beauty, healing the empire's scars after Caligula's madness. The Senate toasted her as the flower of chastity. Yet, beneath the applause lingered unease. In Rome, a woman's virtue was never her own. It was the property of the state. Messalina learned quickly that her body was empire. Her womb symbolized continuity, her smile stability, her silence obedience. The girl empress watched senators kneel to her husband, not from love but fear, and saw in that trembling submission a new form of power, one that did not need swords or decrees. It only required hunger. She saw how lust humiliated men who pretended to be gods, and she began to wonder, could the same tool that enslaved women also rule them? At night, when torches dimmed and servants withdrew, the empress vanished. The marble halls of the Palatine held their breath as Valeria Messalina slipped through a hidden gate disguised as a slave. The silk and gold of the imperial household gave way to the stench of Subura, the red-lit underbelly of Rome, where the city's most disposable women sold their bodies for a loaf of bread. Here, no one bowed, no one used her name. Here, the Empress of Rome was just another girl behind a curtain. Ancient chroniclers called these nights madness, but perhaps they were revelation. Messalina's descent into the brothel was not a fall, it was a search. In a world that measured women by purity, she chose the opposite currency defilement as power. The Senate adored her chastity because it made her controllable. The streets offered something different from appetite anonymity, the thrill of being unrecognizable. It was in this darkness that she learned a lesson. Few rulers ever dared confront. Shame could be wielded like a blade. In the cramped smoky rooms of Subura Messalina sat among the city's pornaoi, the lowest class of prostitutes, many of them slaves marked with iron brands. She studied them with fascination, their resilience, their defiance, their unbroken laughter after pain. She began to imitate them then, to compete. Clients entered unaware that the girl with painted lips and perfumed hair was the empress herself. Tacitus claimed she prided herself on endurance, boasting she could outlast any woman in Rome. Whether that account was true or embellished, the symbolism was undeniable. She turned her own body into an instrument of dominance. To Rome's elite sex was hierarchy, but in the brothel, that order inverted. Men who commanded armies crawled to beg. Merchants who dictated prices in the forum paid to touch the lowest flesh. The brothel was democracy stripped bare, its only law desire. And in that mirror of chaos, Messalina found the blueprint for her future rule. Each night she descended deeper, and each dawn she returned to the palace with her hair unbound, her eyes alight. No one dared question her exhaustion. Servants whispered that her perfumes had changed, that she smelled of cheap myrrh and smoke, not royal incense. Claudius noticed nothing. To him, she remained the dutiful wife, the mother of his children, the serene ornament of the empire. But beneath the cosmetics and marble smiles, something in her had shifted. She had tasted a kind of power no title could offer, the ability to choose humiliation and survive it. It is tempting to read this as lust, but that word is too small. Lust is appetite. Messalina's was strategy. Each night she rehearsed inversion, turning weakness into weapon degradation, into command. The more she descended, the more she understood the secret of Rome's men, their terror of exposure. For centuries, Rome had built its power on discipline, on the pretense that men controlled their urges. She knew better now. Behind every senator's stoic gaze lurked the same hunger she had seen in the brothel. If she could manipulate that hunger, she could own them. Historians like Juvenal mocked her as insane, a woman possessed by demonic lust. Yet, their disgust reveals something deeper fear. A woman who refuses shame is uncontrollable. In breaking the boundaries of virtue, Messalina broke the logic of the empire itself. She embodied its paradox, a state that claimed to civilize the world through law, but thrived on domination and pleasure. Archaeologists later uncovered brothel graffiti from Sabura names, scratched beside prices, prayers for protection, curses for cruel clients. Some inscriptions even mention a mysterious Lina, a woman of noble bearing who appeared at night and vanished by dawn. Perhaps a myth, or perhaps the echo of a scandal too dangerous to record openly. By the time the sun rose over the Palatine, the Empress had resumed her role. Silk replaced rags, perfumes masked sweat. The goddess of Rome smiled from her balcony. But the boundary between palace and brothel had already dissolved. What began as escapism had become revelation. The empire's moral walls were as porous as its streets. From that moment, the pattern of her reign was set. She would no longer hide her rebellion, she would refine it. The brothel had taught her the first rule of absolute power control does not require violence. It requires consent, manufactured through shame. And so, within months, the Empress who once walked among the whores began turning her palace into their mirror. What happens when the palace itself becomes the brothel and every noble forced to play their part? The Palatine Palace, heart of empire, altar of order, became something else. Behind its bronze gates and marble pillars, Rome's most sacred institution began to imitate the city's darkest corners. Messalina no longer needed to sneak into Sabura. She brought Sabura to her throne. At first, the transformation was subtle. Banquets stretched later into the night. Servants whispered of unfamiliar guests. Gladiators, actors, foreign slaves summoned not for counsel, but amusement. Senators reclined on ivory couches as dancers entered the air, thick with spiced wine and the cloying scent of amber oil. But amid the laughter, an unease grew. The Empress had changed the rules. Messalina presided like a priestess of excess. Draped in gold, her eyes cold, and assessing, she decided who would rise and who would fall, not through decree, but through humiliation. Aristocratic women were forced to attend, dressed in transparent silks, forbidden to avert their gaze. Their husbands sat beside them, unable to intervene. knowing one wrong glance could mean ruin. The games of state became games of flesh. One evening, according to Suetonius Messalina, ordered a nobleman's wife to kneel before her husband in front of the entire court to prove her devotion. The crowd laughed, forced laughter, the kind that echoes fear. From that night onward, obedience was measured in silence. Each scandal deepened the court's complicity. Claudius, ever the scholar, retreated further into study. Some said he knew and chose ignorance. Others believed she bewitched him, his need for her approval stronger than his sense of dignity. Either way, the emperor's silence made her unstoppable. In Rome, silence was assent. Messalina discovered that degradation could be ritualized. What began as private pleasure turned into imperial policy. She summoned gladiators' bodies honed for death to her chambers, forcing senators to watch as she embraced them. When disgust flickered across a man's face, she remembered it. Later, his estate would mysteriously fall under investigation, his wife summoned to entertain the empress. Every act of resistance became a performance she could replay in vengeance. The palace turned into a theater of submission. Every corridor whispered hierarchy, every gesture a test. Courtiers learned to smile when they wanted to scream to praise what sickened them. Rome's moral vocabulary, virtue, honor, chastity, was hollowed out and filled with parody. The empire that once disciplined the world now fed on its own shame. It is easy centuries later to see Messalina as monstrous. But monsters are mirrors. She exposed what Rome already was, a civilization that worshipped order but hungered for spectacle. In her, the contradictions simply became visible. She fused sex and politics, turning the body into empire's truest stage. The senators who condemned her excesses still paid for brothel slaves. The moralists who wrote against her still attended her feasts. They did not hate her depravity, they hated her audacity to own it. Each night, her banquets grew more elaborate, more obscene. Platters overflowed with oysters and figs soaked in honey. Fountains of wine poured until dawn. But amid the decadence, something colder ruled observation. Messalina watched her guests with the precision of an accountant, noting every blush, every tremor of envy. The empress had learned that power was not in desire itself, but in forcing others to perform it. Soon, rumors spread that the palace contained a secret chamber, a private amphitheater draped in purple, where nobles were made to enact their own humiliation. Some called it superstition, others survival. Yet, those who entered rarely spoke of what they saw. What mattered was not the acts themselves, but the silence they produced. That silence seeped into every corner of Rome. The Senate debated laws, while knowing its highest members had knelt before the empress. The Praetorian Guard swore loyalty while fearing her spies. The line between the state and the bedchamber vanished. For the first time, the machinery of governance was fueled not by glory or duty, but by humiliation. And through it all, Messalina smiled. She had found the empire's pulse, not in marble or legions, but in the quiver of fear beneath polished words. She ruled not as Claudius's wife, nor even as Rome's empress, but as its conscience inverted. By day, she appeared pious and serene, and attending temples, blessing veterans, whispering petitions into the emperor's ear. By night, she presided over rituals of disgrace that bound her enemies tighter than chains. Every man who obeyed her lost something irretrievable. Not just honor, but the illusion of control. That was her true genius. She understood that a broken man obeys longer than a frightened one. And so the brothel of Sabura became the blueprint of empire. Messalina had turned Rome's most private shame into its most public secret. What happens when the Empress's theatre becomes institutionalized, when humiliation itself is written into the machinery of state? What begins as indulgence always ends as system. By the early 40s CE, the private depravity of the palace had ossified into bureaucracy. The Empress no longer needed to hide her appetite behind banquets or laughter. She had transformed it into administration. The House of Rome now ran quite literally like a brothel. In a quiet villa near the Campus Martius Messalina, established what chroniclers would later call the Domus Meretricia Imperialis, the imperial house of pleasure. To the public, it appeared a pleasure estate for foreign dignitaries. In truth, it was the beating heart of a new form of control. Here, the Empress combined the two engines of empire lust and record-keeping. Everything had a ledger. Every woman, whether senator's daughter or captured slave, was assigned a price. Every act a note in the scrolls of her attendants. The Empress turned desire into documentation. Aristocratic women summoned to the villa arrived under pretexts of diplomacy or devotion. Once inside, the doors locked. Guards confiscated their jewelry, their titles, their names. They were given false ones, Lyra Chione Irene, identities as fragile as parchment. Messalina would then preside not as participant, but as overseer, watching her guests through gauze curtains. Senators and merchants entered, expecting entertainment, only to find themselves trapped in a play whose script she alone possessed. Each encounter generated intelligence. Each humiliation became collateral. The Empress's scribes, often eunuchs or freedmen, recorded every confession muttered, between gasps, every careless boast, every plea for secrecy. Later, those same notes resurfaced as imperial decrees, land seizures, demotions, sudden appointments. No law cited her name, yet every decision bore her signature. Messalina had discovered what Rome's generals never could, that the mind breaks more completely through the body than through war. Soon, rumors spread through the city that the emperor's household had become a trap. Yet, no one dared resist. The palace controlled not only the army's payroll, but the city's desire for spectacle. Those who denounced her were mocked as prudish. Those who obeyed her were rewarded with access and favor. The Senate learned to fear scandal more than death. In this machinery, even virtue became currency. A man who flaunted chastity invited suspicion. A woman too modest drew attention. To survive was to perform corruption convincingly. The brothel was no longer a place. It was a language, a system of coded gestures and silences. Messalina had institutionalized the logic of Sabura that control is achieved not through force, but through consent, engineered by shame. Archaeological fragments hint at the scale of her Operation Bronze name tags, small as coins, inscribed with both Greek and Latin numerals. Scholars once thought them gaming tokens. Now they are believed to have catalogued the women of the imperial villa. Some bear the faint etching of laurel leaves, perhaps signifying noble birth. Others, the letters DM for Domus Messalinae. Even in anonymity, the hierarchy remained precise. Claudius's absence from this world was its foundation. His bureaucratic reforms, his obsession with census and taxation provided the perfect cover. While he counted citizens, she counted secrets. The empire's data became her arsenal. Where her husband ruled by decree, she ruled by dossier. Rome's famed order its files, archives, signatures became instruments of blackmail. The Senate may have written laws. Messalina decided who trembled under them. It was no longer possible to distinguish pleasure from policy. The villa near Campus Martius hosted nightly gatherings that resembled both ritual and interrogation. Guests were invited to indulge, filmed by memory, ensnared by consequence. The city's moral rot now had clerks and schedules. The Empress had created a bureaucracy of desire, a government of the flesh. And yet, for all its precision, the system depended on silence. One confession, one runaway could unravel the illusion. Thus, punishment became spectacle. A noblewoman who refused to participate was paraded through the palace corridors naked except for her jewels, while Messalina recited verses from Ovid about obedience. The laughter of courtiers masked terror. The lesson was clear. Resistance was the only true obscenity. When night fell, the ledgers closed, and Rome slept under the illusion of stability. But in the villa's cellars, slaves dried the ink on parchment heavy with the empire's shame. Each scroll bore the same wax seal, a serpent biting its own tail. Messalina's emblem. The cycle of pleasure and punishment complete. Through her Rome reached a terrible perfection, sin, rendered systematic humiliation converted into governance. The empire had built aqueducts to move water roads, to move legions, and now through the Empress, it had built an infrastructure for desire. When everything can be priced, what happens to the soul of a city? When lust becomes ledger, what remains sacred? Every empire begins with a story about virtue and survives by monetizing its vices. Under Messalina, Rome learned how to tax humiliation. The brothel had already become a bureau. Now it became a treasury. What had once been sin was reclassified as revenue. The ledgers from the villa near the Campus Martius, those fragments of papyrus unearthed centuries later, reveal the meticulous logic of her design. Each encounter, each secret was accounted for, not metaphorically, but literally. Fees paid by senators and generals were deposited through intermediaries into civic funds. The money then financed temples, theatres, even aqueduct repairs. Rome's greatness, its marble and fountains flowed from degradation. The transactions were invisible, but constant. A senator's silence purchased with gold would reappear as a donation to public works. The coins that glittered in sunlight beside the Colosseum's construction sites were the same that had been dropped in trembling hands the night before. The empire ran on circulation of water, of money, of flesh. And Messalina understood better than anyone that the greatest stability comes not from fear, but from dependence. Her blackmail network evolved into an economy of obedience. Generals who wished for commands, merchants who sought licenses, nobles who desired tax exemptions, all found their requests linked somehow to the Empress's favor. Refusal wasn't punished by death, it was punished by exposure. A whisper, a document, a single detail leaked at the wrong moment could end a career more efficiently than any dagger. The Empress no longer needed to seduce. The system seduced for her. The allure of access replaced desire. To be invited to her gatherings, those rumored ritual banquets, where power changed hands through pleasure, was to be included in the empire's true senate. The marble chamber where Claudius read decrees became a theatre of fiction. The villa with its scented lamps and silken couches became the empire's real parliament. Rome's chroniclers, though scandalized, could not deny her intelligence. Suetonius writes of her cold arithmetic of lust, a phrase that perfectly captures her genius. She had turned intimacy into institution. Where her husband kept archives of laws, she kept archives of transgressions. Her empire was not of legions, but of leverage. Consider the paradox in the Republic. Rome punished adultery as a crime against the state. Under Messalina, the state profited from adultery. Even the taxes on brothels officially reinstated by Claudius as part of his fiscal reforms were quietly redirected through her associates. The more scandal flourished, the more stable the treasury appeared. The empire discovered a new principle of survival, that vice, if organized, could sustain order. The moralists of the Senate muttered about decay, but none dared act. They had all in one way or another been absorbed into the Empress's system. A loan forgiven here, a brother spared execution there. Every mercy carried a price, and every transaction deepened the silence. Archaeologists today find the traces of this moral economy scattered through graffiti account fragments and temple dedications. A votive plaque from the Aventine Hill bears the inscription, "For favors received through her grace, I give thanks to Venus." Historians suspect it referred not to the goddess, but to Messalina herself. Her cult of influence had blurred into divinity. To understand the genius of her corruption, one must look beyond scandal. She did not destroy the empire's structure, she perfected it. By merging pleasure with politics, she ensured that every layer of society had a stake in its own degradation. Senators who mocked her in private still owed her in public. Priests who condemned her rituals still accepted her donations. Soldiers who guarded her gates still visited her chambers. Rome's economy, once built on conquest, had turned inward. Its colonies lay not across the sea, but in the hearts of its citizens. And like any successful colony, it extracted resources, secrets, bodies, obedience, until nothing remained uncommodified. Messalina had grasped what even emperors often forgot, that power is most secure when it feels voluntary. Her victims offered themselves. They smiled as they were chained. They toasted her name at feasts. They convinced themselves their complicity was survival. In a sense, it was. For those who refused her system, annihilation came swiftly. One story recorded in fragments by Cassius Dio tells of a senator who attempted to denounce her publicly. Within a week, anonymous accusations of embezzlement surfaced. His estates were seized, his wife summoned to the villa. By month's end, he was found dead. Poison or despair, no one knew. His name vanished from Senate records. His fortune ironically went to fund an aqueduct extension dedicated in Claudius's name. Rome's moral decay, once whispered, now gleamed in marble inscriptions. The aqueduct still stands. Tourists marvel at its arches, not realizing they were paid for with silence. And yet beneath all this order, something dangerous stirred. The machinery Messalina built was too efficient. Its very perfection threatened the illusion of male authority. The Senate's elders gritted their teeth as she turned them into actors in her moral theatre. The emperor's freedmen, sensing opportunity, began collecting their own intelligence notes about the empress's excesses, her debts, her lovers. The system that thrived on surveillance began to devour itself. The irony was almost mathematical. By transforming humiliation into economy, Messalina had tied Rome's prosperity to her corruption. To remove her would mean dismantling the mechanism that kept the Senate obedient and the coffers full. And so for now the city pretended. The festivals continued, the fountains poured, and the empire's conscience drowned in perfumed water. But every ledger has its error column. Every economy of control breeds its deficit of faith. Somewhere in those gilded archives, beneath the wax seals and censored names, the cracks had begun to show. What happens when even religion, the empire's supposed moral foundation, becomes part of the same machinery? When gods themselves are invoked not for purity, but for pleasure. In ancient Rome, religion was not faith, it was structure. Every god had an office, every ritual a legal clause. The temples were less sanctuaries than bureaucracies of the divine. It was in this world of marble order and sacred hierarchy that Messalina found her next instrument of control. Having conquered the Senate through desire, she now set her sights on Rome's most untouchable domain, the gods themselves. To corrupt a temple was to rewrite the contract between mortal and divine. But Messalina understood something deeper, that worship was theatre, and theatre could be owned. She transformed piety into performance. The cults of Venus, goddess of love, and Bacchus, god of ecstasy, were her stage. What began as private vice now draped itself in incense and hymn. During the festival season, Rome's marble courtyards filled with processions, garlands, flutes, and the scent of myrrh. But beneath the chanting, a quiet horror took root. Messalina presided over ceremonies that began with devotion and ended in debasement. Virgins brought offerings to Venus only to find their purity auctioned as divine initiation. Priests, once guardians of chastity, became stagehands in her orgies of faith. Tacitus and Juvenal both mention the transformation of the Bacchanalia. The festival once meant to celebrate divine joy. Under Messalina, it became a state-sponsored ritual of humiliation. Wine-flowed masks hid identities, and boundaries dissolved. Senators found themselves paired with slaves' matrons, forced to dance before the idols they had once venerated. In these nights, the empire's social order inverted, and the empress ruled as both goddess and executioner. She wore white, like a vestal, then stripped the symbol of its sanctity. Let Rome see what its gods truly demand, she is said to have whispered. Her message was blasphemy, masked as revelation, that purity was a performance chastity, a tax, and the gods themselves obedient to pleasure's empire. To a Roman citizen, this was more than scandal, it was cosmic treason. Yet, no uprising came. The city was captivated. The ceremonies were too dazzling, too expensive, too well organized. Lavish processions marched through the streets, funded by the very tributes extorted from the Senate. Each temple feast fed hundreds, each sacrifice a display of imperial bounty. Messalina had achieved the impossible. She had turned religion into public relations. The temple of Venus Erycina on the Capitoline Hill became her headquarters. Once a shrine to marital harmony, it now hosted banquets, where the empress reclined on the altar steps, surrounded by musicians, her fingers stained with sacrificial wine. Statues of the goddess were adorned not with olive wreaths, but with silk veils and jewels confiscated from noble women. At dawn, the altar reeked of incense and human sweat. But the true genius of her sacrilege was psychological. In Rome, piety defined identity. To violate sacred ritual meant social death. Messalina used that terror. Her victims bound by faith were trapped between damnation and disgrace. Refuse her invitation and risk being labeled impious a crime that carried exile or execution. Accept it and become complicit in blasphemy. Either way, she owned them. Historians often treat this as moral decay, but it was strategy. By fusing sex and sanctity, she erased Rome's last refuge of moral authority. The senators who once invoked the gods for legitimacy now found their prayers contaminated. Even the Vestal virgins, the very embodiment of divine purity, were not beyond her reach. A rumor spread that one under threat had been forced to serve wine at one of Messalina's feasts. If true, it marked a line crossed not by passion, but by calculation. Religion became another ledger, another theatre of debt. Donations once made to temples were funneled into her coffers under the guise of sacred contributions. When citizens prayed, they prayed through her network of priests, all loyal to her favor. The gods were now bureaucrats under imperial payroll, and the people the same crowd that filled the circuses and amphitheaters watched in fascination. Some condemned her, others adored her, but none could look away. The rituals were too grand, the scandal too enthralling. Rome's conscience was eroding not through shock, but through spectacle. Even Claudius Emperor and Pontifex Maximus, the supreme priest of Rome, remained paralyzed. His silence, once weakness, had become complicity. When priests whispered of profanation, he smiled faintly, insisting the empress merely sought to revive the passions of the gods. Perhaps he believed it. Perhaps he needed to. From this point, the Roman Empire entered a strange equilibrium: holiness as entertainment sin, as state ritual. Messalina had converted the sacred calendar into her personal script. Festivals no longer marked divine seasons, they marked her moods. The year itself revolved around her desires. Archaeological finds confirm traces of this transformation. A fragment of fresco from the Palatine showing Venus surrounded by attendants bearing censers, their gestures disturbingly erotic. Coins minted briefly in 47 CE, depicting a veiled woman crowned with vine leaves, an image scholars debate even now, uncertain whether it was Venus Bacchus or Messalina herself. By this point, she had reached the summit of her power. The Senate feared her, the temples served her, the people adored and despised her in equal measure. She had woven pleasure into Rome's very soul. But every system of indulgence carries a hidden deficit. By turning religion into theatre, Messalina had erased not only the god's authority, but her own foundation. When everything becomes sacred, nothing is. When everyone kneels for pleasure, reverence ceases to exist. The empress had conquered devotion itself, and in doing so left the empire without faith. When faith collapses and spectacle reigns, what remains to satisfy the void? For Messalina, the answer would be one last contest, the one that would define her legend forever. There are moments when power drunk on its own perfection seeks proof of its divinity. For Messalina, that moment arrived one fevered night when she decided to turn her supremacy into spectacle, to test whether any mortal man or woman could match her endurance. It was not love nor lust, but demonstration, a declaration that the empire's goddess of shame could defeat even its goddesses of desire. According to Juvenal, the empress summoned Scylla, Rome's most celebrated courtesan, famed for her beauty and resilience. She proposed a wager who could take the greater number of lovers in one night. the contest was staged not in secret, but in calculated semi-privacy, witnessed by attendants, guards, and select noblemen sworn to silence by terror. It was a ritual of measurement, the final fusion of sex and state. The setting was decadent to the point of obscenity. The chamber glowed with lamplight reflecting off polished marble. Musicians played slow rhythmic flutes. Perfume hung so thick it stung the eyes. On a raised couch of purple silk, Messalina reclined in full imperial regalia, pearls draped across her shoulders, a diadem glittering above her damp hair. Scylla, by contrast, appeared bare, unadorned, confident in the simplicity of her craft. The duel began. Hour after hour passed. One by one, men were summoned, gladiators, slaves, nobles, guards, each leaving drained and wordless. Witnesses claimed Messalina never paused her gaze, fixed not on her partners, but on Scylla herself, as if feeding on the other woman's exhaustion. By dawn, Scylla collapsed gasping in defeat. Messalina, her skin gleaming with sweat and wine, turned to her attendants and said, "Am I not still Empress?" That phrase would echo across centuries, not as pride, but prophecy. Historians still debate whether the event occurred exactly as recorded. But even if exaggerated, it captured a truth greater than fact. Messalina's obsession was not pleasure, it was transcendence through humiliation. She had reduced Rome's most intimate act to arithmetic. Desire became data. Flesh became proof of rule. Her victory over Scylla was symbolic. The professional woman undone by the imperial one. The economy of pleasure consumed by the bureaucracy of domination. The next morning, the story spread through whispers across the city. Servants carried it to the markets, soldiers murmured it in barracks, poets scribbled it in lamplit margins. The Empress who outlasted Venus, they said. Some laughed, others crossed themselves. Yet even those who condemned her felt something more dangerous: envy. For in her defiance, Messalina had inverted Rome's entire moral geometry. The virtue of restraint, the discipline of self, the sacred distinction between matron and courtesan, all shattered beneath her name. To her admirers, she was divine excess incarnate. To her enemies, the empire's corruption made flesh. But to herself, she was neither sinner nor saint, only proof that domination was the only honest language left in Rome. That night marked the pivot of her reign. Having conquered sex, she no longer sought secrecy. She demanded audience. Her spectacles grew larger, crueler, almost theatrical in their intent. Gladiators were ordered to perform mock marriages before combat. The brides stripped of veils before the crowd. Noble women were invited to preside over these games as priestesses of Venus, their trembling disguised as piety. Each act chipped away at Rome's public conscience, and the crowd's horror turned to habit. It was a masterpiece of moral conditioning. By making outrage routine, Messalina drained it of power. What once shocked now merely entertained. The city had become addicted to its own disgust. Psychologists centuries later would call this habituation of cruelty. Rome experienced it firsthand. The more she displayed sin, the less anyone cared. Even poets who once weaponized satire against vice fell silent. They depended on her patronage. The Empress funded the arts temples, even orphanages, paradoxical tokens of charity purchased with the proceeds of humiliation. It was as if she were daring the gods to strike her, and they, amused or indifferent, did not. But every empire of spectacle feeds on escalation. Messalina's triumph over Scylla was not an end but a challenge to herself. Her body once tool now became symbol, an altar demanding larger sacrifices. When indulgence ceased to thrill, she turned to cruelty. When power ceased to awe, she turned to blasphemy. What she sought now was not pleasure, but confirmation that no boundary divine or mortal could contain her. One account, almost apocryphal, describes her visiting the Temple of Venus after her victory. Alone before dawn, she offered incense and whispered, "If the goddess still reigns, let her strike me down." The thunder that followed was distant, the kind that never reaches ground. She laughed. By now, the Senate's fear had ripened into paralysis. To accuse her was suicide, to ignore her complicity. Claudius's advisors urged caution. The Empress, one wrote, has become the empire's heart disease deadly, but to cut it out is to kill the patient. And indeed, Rome continued to function. Taxes collected armies, marched laws passed. On paper, the empire was stable, but beneath the marble, its soul was corroding. The moral structure that had once justified conquest, the illusion of virtue, was dissolving. Messalina had not destroyed Rome. She had revealed it. For centuries, the city had enslaved bodies, silenced women, commodified desire. Only now the roles had reversed. The master became spectacle, the spectator became slave. And at the center of this inversion stood one woman, triumphant and doomed, her laughter echoing through the same halls that would one day erase her name. What happens when fear replaces faith? When shame alone binds the empire together? Messalina's next act would show how terror, not lust, became Rome's true religion. Rome had always known power through spectacle. But under Messalina, fear itself became the empire's new architecture, the invisible scaffolding that held every senator, priest, and soldier upright. The brothel had taught her how shame breaks men more efficiently than torture. Now she made that lesson law. The transformation was almost silent. There were no new decrees, no public proclamations. The empress didn't need them. Every noble already understood the unspoken contract obedience in exchange for survival. To cross her was to risk exposure, to have one's private sins made public, whispered by slaves, copied into records spread by rumor until one's honor dissolved. Rome. That great machine of hierarchy and reputation ran on appearances. She learned to weaponize them. Her system was simple. For every man in power, she had a ledger, literal or symbolic, filled with secrets. A senator's adulterous tryst, a priest's embezzled offering, a general's misused funds, a wife's unchaste letter intercepted by palace servants. Each sin was catalogued, each debtor kept in perpetual debt. To purge oneself of guilt was impossible. The only path to safety was silence and further obedience. Within months, the Senate no longer debated policy. It rehearsed loyalty. Sessions that once thundered with rhetoric now echoed with scripted flattery. The emperor, isolated and distracted by endless correspondence, mistook submission for peace. Messalina's shadow ruled the room. She had no throne yet. Every man's conscience bent toward her approval. And what she controlled through fear, her attendants enforced through whispers. Freedmen, eunuchs, and scribes became Rome's secret police. They spread rumors of divine dreams, portents, and omens, each conveniently validating the empress's will. The line between gossip and government vanished. Truth itself became a kind of blackmail. Whoever spoke it endangered themselves, and thus no one dared. It was not only the men who trembled. Noble women lived in exquisite fear, terrified of being summoned to the villa, terrified of not being summoned. Both outcomes were ruin. Invitations to her feasts arrived sealed in wax. Opening them felt like touching poison. To refuse was defiance. To attend was surrender. In that perfect trap, virtue itself became self-incrimination. Messalina had crafted an empire where silence was loyalty and fear was faith. The temples that once guarded morality now echoed with forced prayers for her safety. The priests she humiliated publicly now blessed her name in private ceremonies. To the Romans who believed the gods punished moral corruption, her survival seemed proof of divine favor. Thus, paradoxically, her impunity bred worship. She had turned blasphemy into theology. Psychologically, this was genius. Every tyrant before her ruled through dread of death. She ruled through dread of disgrace, a fear that does not end with dying. She understood what philosophers only theorized, that shame is eternal. Its echo lingers long after the body perishes. A senator could endure exile. He could not endure laughter. Even the Praetorian Guard, the empire's elite soldiers, were drawn into her web. Once sworn only to protect the emperor, they now guarded his wife with equal zeal. Not from love, but from uncertainty. Messalina rewarded loyalty with access to her banquets, her confidence, her secrets. The guards who stood watch outside her chambers at night were not protecting her. They were imprisoned by her charisma. She made them accomplices in the empire's unspoken crimes. Fear seeped into every marble crack of the city. In markets, vendors lowered their voices when mentioning the empress. In taverns, her name was spoken like a curse disguised as a prayer. Rome had survived famine, fire, and war, but it had never endured a contagion of conscience like this. Citizens began to censor their dreams. The empress had found the perfect substitute for law. Fear required no courts, no armies, no speeches. It was self-regulating, invisible, and renewable. Once instilled, it multiplied on its own. She had made morality obsolete, and yet this system was fragile because it depended entirely on her presence. Fear, like devotion, requires a focus. Remove the idol and believers, remember they are many. That awareness was beginning to stir. Among Claudius's freedmen, those low-born administrators who owed their status to his bureaucratic reforms, resentment simmered. They had long tolerated her power as necessary for stability, but now her humiliations touched even them. One evening, according to later accounts, a freedman named Narcissus, loyal to Claudius and deeply pragmatic, was forced to attend one of her feasts. There he saw senators stripped of dignity, nobles performing as slaves, laughter dissolving into sobs. He understood then what the Senate would not, that Messalina's Rome had become unsustainable. The empire was no longer ruled, it was staged, and every performance must end. But for now, the stage burned brightly. The empress reigned through contradiction, loved for her beauty, feared for her appetite, obeyed for her cruelty. She had succeeded where emperors failed, not by commanding the legions, but by conquering the human mind. And so the paradox deepened. Rome, proud of its reason, now worshipped its delirium. The philosophers who taught moderation now toasted excess. The priests who preached piety now administered vice. The emperor who ruled in name slept beside the woman who ruled in truth. Every smile in the Senate was rehearsed. Every cheer in the theater was insurance. The empire's grandeur still dazzled, but its foundation trembled not from rebellion, but from the exhaustion of pretending. How long can terror masquerade as order before the mask cracks? For Messalina, the answer would come not through revolt, but through one audacious act so public, so blasphemous, it would shatter even fear itself. By the autumn of 48 CE, Rome had become an empire of whispers. Fear ruled in silence, and silence had made Messalina invincible. But even perfection decays when it runs out of audience. Power built on spectacle demands escalation. And Messalina, having conquered men temples and the Senate itself, turned at last to her final, fatal stage marriage. The setting was almost absurd in its audacity. Emperor Claudius. Her husband was away in Ostia, overseeing harbour construction. The city was calm, its politics predictable, its officials complacent. Into that stillness, Messalina unleashed chaos disguised as ceremony. She announced that she, the Empress of Rome, would remarry publicly legally, and immediately to her lover, the Senator Gaius Silius, one of the most admired men in the city. It was not a clandestine affair, not rebellion in shadows. It was theatre in broad daylight. Invitations were sent, musicians rehearsed, priests were summoned. The wedding procession wound through Rome's streets like a parody of holiness. Flowers rained from balconies. Crowds gathered in disbelief. The empress, crowned with garlands, led the march as if the gods themselves had sanctioned her blasphemy. In Roman law, the act was unthinkable. She was still married to Claudius, the Pontifex Maximus, the supreme priest of all Rome. To wed another man while the emperor lived was treason by definition punishable by death. But Messalina no longer believed in law. She believed in momentum, the delusion of the powerful, that spectacle itself protects them. Some historians argue she intended to replace Claudius entirely. Silius Young, eloquent and politically connected, had many admirers in the Senate. Perhaps she imagined a coup disguised as romance, that by marrying him she could crown a new emperor, one bound to her by passion and fear alike. Others say she sought self-destruction, a compulsion for exposure to burn the stage she had built. But one truth unites both theories: she no longer distinguished between the theatre of pleasure and the theatre of power. The ceremony took place in full view of the public. Priests officiated. Witnesses signed contracts. Messalina and Silius exchanged vows beside the very altars that had once sanctified her as Claudius's wife. As incense coiled into the air, Rome itself seemed to hold its breath. Never in its history had a living empress force declared herself the bride of another man. It was a blasphemy so vast it could only be called devotion to chaos itself. At the feast that followed, the empress laughed louder than any guest. She raised her cup and toasted her own undoing. Around her, senators smiled thinly, their minds racing. They had lived too long under her reign of fear to intervene. No one knew whether the gods or the emperor would strike first. Meanwhile, in Ostia, the news reached Claudius like thunder. The accounts differ on his reaction. Some say he laughed, believing it an impossible rumor. Others record that he turned pale and asked repeatedly, "Am I still emperor?" It was Narcissus, the freedman who had once watched her humiliation rituals in silence, who acted. He saw that hesitation would doom them all. Riding through the night with a contingent of soldiers, he brought Claudius back to the city before the Senate could fracture, between loyalty and terror. In Rome, panic spread through Messalina's circle. Her attendants scattered, the lover's villa filled with the sound of breaking glass, shredded documents, and frantic whispers. For the first time in years, the Empress felt the air shift. The silence she had cultivated now roared against her. Yet, even as soldiers closed in, she refused to believe the world could turn on her. Power had always forgiven her. Desire had always shielded her. She sent messengers to Claudius, pleading for an audience, claiming madness, claiming ritual possession, claiming love. Every excuse was an echo of her reign, half confession, half performance. Claudius's advisors debated what to do. The Senate demanded her execution. Some generals argued exile. Claudius himself, ever the vacillating scholar, hesitated again. Perhaps he still loved her. Perhaps he feared her ghost more than her guilt. Meanwhile, Messalina hid within the gardens of the Domus Luculliana, the estate where she had once hosted her most lavish feasts. The irony was perfect. The place of her triumphs became her prison. She wandered among the fountains, still dressed in her wedding finery garlands, wilting jewels glinting in fading sunlight. Witnesses said she seemed dazed, muttering to herself, lines from tragic plays. "Have I not given Rome its gods? Must Rome not worship me?" The Senate's patience broke. Narcissus, acting on imperial authority, ordered her execution without waiting for the emperor's final word. He knew Claudius's hesitation could become forgiveness, and forgiveness would mean the end of them all. The soldiers marched toward the gardens. Even then, the Empress did not flee. She still believed spectacle would save her, that her beauty, her tears, her voice could charm history itself. When the centurions arrived, she asked to see a mirror to fix her hair before dying. Her final gesture, they said, was vanity, disguised as dignity. The empire she had ruled through humiliation would end with a single command. But could even death silence the woman who had turned desire into empire? The next act would reveal that her execution was only the beginning of her legend, and Rome's reckoning with its own reflection. The garden of the Domus Luculliana was eerily quiet that afternoon. Wind carried the smell of cut myrtle and iron. It was the same garden where Messalina had once held midnight feasts, now transformed into her final stage. The woman who had ruled through appetite, who had turned shame into government, now faced the one boundary even she could not transgress, the limit of flesh itself. According to Tacitus, when the soldiers arrived, she was found sitting by a fountain. Her wedding garlands half wilted, her hands stained with wine and dirt. Her mother, Domitia Lepida, stood beside her, an older mirror of what Messalina might have become had she chosen restraint. Lepida pleaded with her daughter to face death with courage, to end the farce with one dignified act. "You have lived as an empress," she whispered. "Die as one." But courage is a habit, and Messalina's life had taught only control through others' fear, never through her own. She tried to speak, but words failed her. For the first time, the woman who had commanded senators into silence found herself voiceless. When Narcissus entered, she recognized him instantly, the freedman who had once endured her banquets, the bureaucrat, who had watched, memorized, and waited. He did not gloat. He simply read the emperor's orders in the measured tone of a clerk. The empress is to die. The emperor will not see her. There was no mention of treason, adultery, or blasphemy, only her name stripped of titles, stripped of divinity. Tacitus records that a dagger was handed to her. For a moment she stared at it, as if trying to recall what courage felt like. She pressed the blade to her throat, but could not drive it home. Her hands shook. History is cruel enough to remember that detail. When she faltered, a soldier stepped forward and finished the act. Her blood ran into the same fountain that had reflected her laughter years before. That is the image history preserves Rome's Empress of Lust, dying amid roses, still half beautiful, half erased. But her death was not the end. It was the beginning of Rome's self-denial. Claudius, informed that it was done, reportedly asked for wine. "Then let us dine," he said. A pause. Then, "She is dead." Whether those words carried relief, shock, or disbelief, no one could tell. His courtiers applauded the safest reaction in an empire built on performance. The next day, the machinery of erasure began. Her statues were pulled down, her name chiseled from inscriptions, her portraits melted for their gold frames. Damnatio memoriae, the Roman practice of unmaking a person, turning them from history into rumor. It was the punishment reserved for those whose crimes were so immense that they must be forgotten. But forgetting is its own kind of immortality. In the taverns and alleys, stories multiplied. Some said her ghost haunted the gardens, still wearing the wilted crown, still seeking her mirror. Others swore that Claudius, in drunken nostalgia, once ordered a new statue of her built and then destroyed it again the next morning. Every retelling made her more myth than woman. Narcissus, the architect of her fall, fared no better. For all his discipline, he could not escape the taint of the act. Within a few years, he would die mysteriously poisoned, perhaps, by those who feared he might wield the same power of exposure again. Rome consumes its executors as efficiently as its idols. But what lingers most about Messalina's execution is not the death itself. It's the strange quiet that followed. No rebellion, no outrage. Rome exhaled as if a fever had broken. The Senate resumed its rituals. The priests cleansed the altars. The marble facades gleamed once more. The city pretended restoration. Yet, beneath that illusion, something irreversible had occurred. The empire had seen its reflection too clearly. Messalina's reign had not merely corrupted Rome, it had revealed what it already was. A civilization addicted to spectacle, obsessed with hierarchy, terrified of exposure. When she fell, the city did not repent. It adapted. Shame was still currency. Only the issuer had changed. Even the moralists who condemned her could not erase her shadow from their rhetoric. Philosophers invoked her name as cautionary tale, poets as metaphor for desire's empire. Sculptors secretly copied her likeness onto Venus statues. And generations later, Christian chroniclers would recycle her image as the archetype of the whore of Babylon, the eternal emblem of civilization undone by pleasure. In truth, Rome had not destroyed Messalina. It had absorbed her. Her methods, humiliation, spectacle, fear, became the invisible grammar of power that every emperor after Claudius would inherit. Nero perfected it. Domitian institutionalized it. The empire's marble order would forever carry the scent of her perfume and the stain of her dread. And so the empress, who could not face her own blade, succeeded in piercing history itself. Her death was meant to cleanse Rome, yet it only confirmed the infection's permanence. Her final silence still lingers in those who lead through spectacle, who trade truth for theatre, who govern not by reason, but by humiliation disguised as unity. Messalina's body died in the garden. Her method survived the empire. But what does it mean when an empire erases what it cannot stop imitating? When history condemns its own reflection? The answer would unfold in the next chapter. Rome's moral resurrection built upon her ghost. Erasure in Rome was never silence, it was performance. When Claudius ordered the damnatio memoriae of Messalina, it was not to forget her, but to publicly prove that forgetting could be controlled. The Senate convened under marble arches, still echoing her laughter. Her name was recited once then, struck from the record, as if language itself could absolve the empire of memory. In a single day, artisans chipped her face off of coins. Scribes burned her letters, and sculptors took hammers to her statues. The marble dust that once formed her beauty now settled like ash over the city that had worshipped her. But the more they erased, the more she multiplied. Each chisel strike turned into a whisper. Each vanished inscription became a story retold. Rome could destroy her likeness, but not the fascination she embodied. The psychology of obliteration was simple. By condemning her, Rome cleansed itself. The empire had learned this ritual from religion. Sacrifice the transgressor, declare purity restored. But the moral theatre was hollow. Messalina's crimes, lust, manipulation, domination, had not been aberrations. They were reflections of Rome's deepest truths, magnified through a woman who dared to act out what men only fantasized in secret. As the Senate debated her erasure, many of those who voted for it had once been her willing participants. Their guilt demanded a scapegoat. And so the city projected its own moral rot onto her corpse. In condemning her, they condemned the mirror she had held up. Claudius, ever the bureaucratic emperor, signed the decree without ceremony. He did not speak her name again. Yet, he never remarried out of affection. He remarried out of policy. His next wife, Agrippina, would be colder, sharper, and far more dangerous, a woman who studied Messalina's downfall as instruction, not warning. From her would come Nero, the seed of Rome's next catastrophe. This cycle of woman as moral disaster, followed by empire as silent accomplice, became Rome's new religion. The poets began rewriting her story almost immediately. Juvenal and Tacitus transformed her into allegory. In their hands, she ceased to be human. She became a symptom, a convenient embodiment of chaos, a metaphor for the empire's decaying virtue. But beneath the rhetoric, a quieter truth persisted. Rome needed her. Without Messalina, there could be no performance of purity. Her downfall allowed senators to pose as moral guardians, philosophers to write treatises on moderation, priests to rededicate temples, all while continuing the same hypocrisies in private. Her erasure gave them permission to continue sinning under the banner of reform. Archaeology confirms the absurdity of that pretense. In the ruins of the Palatine, fragments of frescoes survive sensual, vivid, unmistakably hers. Not all were destroyed. Some were merely plastered over, hidden behind new walls built by later emperors. When those walls cracked centuries later, the original images emerged intact, Messalina, reclining like Venus, surrounded by attendants. Beneath centuries of whitewash, her colours still burned. And perhaps that is the truest metaphor for Rome itself. You can bury shame under marble, but marble decays. You can decree forgetting, but desire remembers. The empire that claimed to worship law and reason could not live without the chaos she represented. Messalina became the spectre of continuity proof that moral reform in Rome was always theatre staged for the benefit of those already guilty. Even Christian chroniclers centuries later could not resist invoking her. They denounced her as the whore of Babylon, yet used her image to warn against female power. Her legend survived precisely because it terrified men that beauty could rule more completely than armies that desire could unmake laws faster than any rebellion. In the end, the damnatio memoriae was not the end of Messalina's story. It was her apotheosis. Erased from public record, she entered myth, a ghost wandering the boundary between history and imagination. The more Rome tried to silence her, the more enduring her echo became. Standing today among the ruins of the Palatine Hill, archaeologists still find traces of her names scratched in hidden corners, initials in marble feminine figures hastily recarved into goddesses. It's as if even the stone refused to forget. The empire that tried to deny her became the monument that immortalized her. Philosophical focus. What does it mean when civilization must destroy its own creation to prove its purity? Messalina's erasure was not an act of justice. It was an act of confession. Rome admitted through the violence of forgetting that its ideals were unsustainable without hypocrisy. The empress who lived for spectacle had the last performance. The empire itself became her final stage. And yet the story does not end in marble dust or imperial decrees. Because Messalina's method, her fusion of desire control and spectacle, did not die with her. It became the invisible bloodstream of Western power itself. That is the true legacy to be confronted. Messalina's story did not vanish with her body. It seeped into Rome's bloodstream, into the way power dressed itself, justified itself, and punished itself. Every empire that came after inherited her grammar domination disguised as morality spectacle, repackaged as virtue, humiliation institutionalized as order. Her reign was not a scandal of lust, it was a blueprint for civilization's appetite for control through shame. Even centuries later, Rome still whispered her name when speaking of corruption. But what they refused to admit was this: she had not corrupted Rome. Rome had created her. She was the purest expression of its contradictions. A society that worshipped virtue, but celebrated conquest, that adored beauty, yet fed on submission, could only ever produce an empress who turned those contradictions into law. After her execution, the city returned to its rituals, processions of piety, sacrifices to the gods, vows of renewal. The same streets where her wedding to Silius had marched, now echoed with prayers for divine forgiveness. But under the incense and chants, nothing had changed. Rome remained addicted to spectacle. It only shifted the stage from Messalina's bedroom to the amphitheater, from private humiliation to public execution. When Nero ascended, he studied her story with fascination. He too learned that fear could be entertainment, that scandal could cleanse politics. What Messalina had invented in secret chambers, he broadcast in arenas. He turned empire into theatre, her legacy amplified to imperial scale. In that sense, she was not an aberration. She was prophecy. And as the centuries unfolded, her ghost traveled beyond Rome. Medieval chroniclers turned her into a cautionary tale. Renaissance painters transformed her into erotic allegory, and modern historians labeled her a pervert to preserve their own civility. Yet, beneath every retelling lay the same truth. Societies need their Messalinas, They need figures to absorb their moral guilt, to embody the sins that sustain their order. The whore, the witch, the hysteric, the immoral woman. Each is a reincarnation of the Empress, erased yet never gone. Because shame is not merely punishment, it's control. It disciplines desire by displaying its consequences. Rome's true genius was not in law or architecture, it was in codifying shame as governance. Messalina showed how effectively humiliation could regulate behavior long after the whip had stopped. And the modern world still obeys that lesson. Think of the echoes political scandals turned into moral theatre, tabloid trials disguised as justice, the fascination with fallen women, disgraced leaders, public confession. Every age reenacts Rome's addiction to moral spectacle. The difference is only the medium. Where Messalina's downfall was carved in marble and blood, ours unfolds on screens and headlines. But the logic is identical. Power maintains itself by staging sin, then punishing it publicly. Philosophers call this the economy of shame, a system in which every civilization must manufacture transgression in order to prove its virtue. Messalina was its prototype. Her story became Western civilization's favorite ritual: condemn what secretly fascinates, destroy what quietly sustains. Rome erased her name to declare its purity. In doing so, it enshrined her forever. And perhaps that is the most haunting truth. When we look back at her, we are not looking at a monster. We are looking at a mirror. The empress who ruled through pleasure merely exposed the empire's dependency on it. Her excess was not deviance, it was revelation. She stripped the mask off Roman order and showed that beneath marble and rhetoric lay the same desire to dominate and to be dominated, to gaze and to be shamed. If power has a soul, Messalina revealed its anatomy. It is not forged in courage or intellect, but in performance. How one commands attention, bends morality, and survives exposure. That is why her story refuses to die. Because every empire, every institution, every spectacle of moral outrage still rehearses her script. In the end, her life answers the question that haunted Rome. What happens when the body becomes the empire's stage? The answer is that civilization itself begins to mirror her disease. Beautiful, disciplined, radiant on the surface, and quietly rotting underneath. The ruins of the Palatine still glow at sunset gold and silent. Tourists climb the hill, snapping photos of faded frescoes, unaware that beneath those stones lie the foundations of a city built on humiliation. The wind that moves through those corridors carries no words, but if it did, it would whisper her final truth. The spectacle never ends. When the empires fell, when the marble crumbled, when the philosophers preached virtue again, the machinery of shame survived. And in that survival lies her victory. Messalina's name may have been condemned, but her method became eternal. Her legacy is not lust, it is civilization's addiction to humiliation as proof of order. That is why history cannot bury her, because to bury her is to bury its own reflection.